My German ancestors did not give me the gift of rhythm. But these like locked knees get into worship, and there's just something that happens that you come alive, yeah? Yeah. There's something enlivening about worship, and of course, the culture here is just really beautiful. So part of why I love the culture so much is Pastor Joshua and Pastor Charlie and the team is about stretching us. And I just want to give a word of warning to don't go to a church that's not willing to stretch you. Right? Like a church that's just continuing to perpetuate kind of its tribal norms, and that's kind of what drives it, I would be very weary of. But the church that's wanting to kind of keep expanding, keep growing you. You know, a church is kind of like a container. That's a good thing. Container holds things. But the moment that a container prevents you from actually growing beyond that container is something that you need to be wary of. So I just want to encourage you that you're a part of a community that's about stretching, expanding, and growing us, yes? So that's part of what I'm setting it up today. Because Pastor Joshua asked me to talk about a topic that I think is a good stretch. It's a good stretch for this idea of prayer, this kind of world and space of prayer. And so what I want to do is more of a flyover today and give you kind of an orientation of what I want to talk about. And for some of the skeptics that are out here, I'm going to talk about it, and your eyes are about to glaze over. You're going to be like, this is not for me. I don't want to talk about it. I'm going to try to get you to a place where maybe you're willing and open to add this as a tool in the toolkit of this world and landscape of prayer. So Mark chapter 1, verse 35. And hey, just a quick side note, in Mark, 4 different gospels. And the Gospel of Mark is the shortest because every gospel writer is writing from a different point of view. And they're writing to a different audience. And that actually really matters. And here's just an example. Mark is actually writing, he's a Jewish guy, but he's writing to a Roman audience. And the Roman audience wants it straight and to the point. Jewish audiences tend to like an idea and they kind of circle around an idea, but a Roman audience wants to shoot straight. So guess what? Mark is the shortest gospel, right? But another thing that's interesting about the Gospel of Mark is it's written very subversively as a model or a mirror to the coronation of an emperor. It's actually designed structurally to sort of subvert and call out this Roman emperor that you say is pronouncing the gospel of peace through conquering people, through oppressing people. I'm saying actually, I'm announcing the gospel of Jesus that comes in the name of peace, not to oppress, but to transform. So it's a really beautiful, very subversive book of the Bible. It's fascinating. But in Mark chapter 1, verse 35, it's one of my favorite little verses. Again, it's quick, right? It's a favorite verse because Jesus has just begun his ministry. The day before, he's done 4 miracles. He starts early in the morning. He heals. And by the end of the evening, they're still coming at him and they're wanting him to heal. Of course, Jesus is healing, so they're drawn to him. They're attracted to him. And it says this the very next morning. Now, keep in mind, again, he's had a full-on schedule. And none of us know what a full schedule is, right? Okay, just me. It says this. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Today I want to talk about silence and solitude. How we feel about that? The extroverts already are like, nope, I'm out. Nope, that's for introverts, man. That ain't my thing. That's not what I want to talk about. But I want to talk about silence and solitude. Now, again, hear me out, because I grew up Pentecostal. I did not do that. Silence was not in my tradition. Should have bought a Honda. That was my thing, right? I was charismatic. I was Pentecostal. I love the expression of God, and I still do, and I think it's beautiful, and I'm all about it because God acts through the charism, through the gifts. But there's something that I just kept missing. that I want to point us to and invite us into this idea of what it looks like to engage in the world of silence and solitude. Now, a couple of things that I just want to mention right off the bat. Number one, silence and solitude is not for a personality.
Yeah, that's good.
All right? Again, it tends to, when you hear the word, you're going to get a different reaction for everybody right off the bat. Some of you, like half the room's already really excited that I'm about to speak on this. The other half is like, I'm tuning into ESPN right now. Right? It's actually not for a personality. We tend to think it's for introverts. It's not. In fact, a lot of the extroverts that I engage end up finding it to be even more transformative because it's something that they so desperately need in their own lives. The second thing is it's cross-cultural. It's not for one culture. In fact, the world of contemplative or silence and solitude prayer actually originates out of the Middle East and Africa. Its roots are actually from the world of Africa, and they have made their way throughout the entire world. So number two, the value that you guys live by as a multicultural church is it's actually expressed very beautifully across all cultures. So I want to invite you, number one, it's not for a personality. Number two, it's cross-cultural. And number three, there's a big difference between being silenced and practicing silence. We have to distinguish that because some of us in here we know have experienced so much of that in our history. We have generations and centuries of systemic silencing in our country. And so, of course, why would we want to practice something like that when we've been taught and told to be silent our whole life?
That's good.
That is not this.
Good,
and it's really, really important for us to understand that that's a reality in our culture today that we have to pay very close attention to, but it's also something that we don't want God to prevent us from entering into this space together. Let me just tell you a couple of quick stories. There's a story of a couple that went over to Africa. They were tracing kind of their African roots. And they went with a guide, and they had like a long trip. It was like a 3-day trip into villages that were really far away. This is a long time ago, so they couldn't just fly there. So they get there, and the first day is normal. They get up early in the morning. They spend the whole day. They go hiking and go the long journey. They stop. They set up camp. They go to sleep. They get up in the morning, same thing again. They get up. The guide takes them. They go and go and go. They stop, go to sleep. Next morning, something changes. They wake up, and the guides are still sleeping. And they wake them up, and they're like, hey, we got to go. We got to make it to our destinations. And they kind of shrug them off, and they go back to sleep. And then they try to wake them up again, and they say, what's going on? And the guides say this: we're letting our souls catch up to our bodies.
That's good.
Woo. We're letting our souls catch up to our bodies. If I had an image for the modern world, it would be people walking along in their physical bodies, and if you turn around, about 50 yards behind them is their soul.
That's good, Dave.
And the reason is they're moving so fast. We're distracted, we're moving quick, and that's not an indictment, that's not to make us feel bad, that's just a reality that we live in. And there's good things about that. We move quick, there's efficiency, there's productivity. But I tell you what, when it comes to going deep with God, which if I surveyed every person in this room, how many want to go deep with God? How many want a deeply formed life? You wouldn't be here. So we all want depth. We're a hunger for depth in our life. But everything about our culture, when it comes to distraction, speed, efficiency, productivity, effectiveness, can actually be the very thing that prevents us from going deeper with God. So part of today and part of this orientation around the life and the culture of prayer as a church is to say, what does it look like to create the conditions for depth?
Yeah, that's good.
How do we begin to drill deeper? And what I want to encourage you with is just like anything else. We can end up trying something and it doesn't work and then we kind of give up on it, right? But prayer is just like a muscle.
Yeah.
It's lifelong. It takes a long time. There's setbacks. It's a challenge. So it's a muscle. So what I'm wanting to talk about, I'm just introducing you to the world of silence and solitude today, but really it's an invitation to open your mind up to the possibility that it's a lifelong journey.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, so I just want to give a basic flyover today. The other thing I wanted to mention, I think this is great. You know what the average attention span is for a human being? Take a guess. Throw it out.
10 seconds.
What did you say? 4 minutes. 30 seconds. 13 minutes. You ready? 8 seconds. Yeah. The average attention span of a goldfish, 9 seconds. We have a less attention span than a goldfish. And they've surveyed now, most recently, statistics just came out for Gen Z, it's 3 seconds. So we have to ask the question, what are the implications when it comes to moving beyond a shallow life and into the world of depth with God? So we want to invite to move beyond speed, superficiality, and distraction without the reality that will exist in our life, and we're not trying to remove it entirely. How do we engage that world? So I want to just give kind of a framing on what contemplative prayer is. I want to show us a little bit of how that exists in the scriptures today, and then I want to show you a couple of practices. We're going to be very, very simple today. But I do want to give just a quick, because you don't know who I am. My mom, very quickly, my mom was 7 months pregnant with me, and she was up early one morning and she was praying like she does every single morning. So she was listening with God in deep prayer, and she felt in that moment the Spirit say, go to the hospital right now. And she didn't feel anything physically. She just sensed the Spirit said, go to the hospital. Went to the hospital, did an ultrasound. They saw that the umbilical cord was wrapped around my neck, and they did an emergency C-section, pulled me out, and I wasn't breathing. And obviously I'm here. They resuscitated me, brought me back to life, and went through a process of healing. But I'm here talking about prayer because it saved my life. Like from the very beginning. So prayer for me is not like some religious thing that religious people do and pious people do. It's actually existential.
Yeah.
It's actually what saves people's lives. Number two, I just want to mention, prayer was always a struggle in my life. Even as like a pastor, I've been a pastor for 15, 16 years. Prayer has not always been an easy thing for me. I've struggled with it. And that was kind of an embarrassing thing to admit as a pastor. You're supposed to be an expert in everything, including prayer. And I wasn't, and I struggled with it. And it really wasn't until 2014 that I got invited to do a year-long prayer time with a group of guys and started to pray on a regular basis that everything changed in my life. So I just want to encourage you today that I'm not coming up here as an expert. In fact, I would describe myself as a beginner. I think anybody who calls themselves an expert in any spiritual practice is probably missing the point. So the more mature we get spiritually, the more childlike we become. Isn't that fun and liberating?
Great.
Like, we're not experts. I'm not an expert. I'm just trying to figure this out, and we're learning how to grow deeper with God. Now, a couple of things that I just want to highlight on the world of silence and solitude, and then I'm going to get into a couple of differences between the two, and get into a little bit of scripture. Ken Shigematsu stated, "Every one of us has a monk or nun embryo inside us. Deep in our souls, we crave space with God that is defined by silence and solitude." At the very root, it is an invitation to slow down and practice noticing. Now, silence and solitude operates in two very different ways. One, it's a way of life. And then number two, it's actually like a spiritual practice. Like you do it specifically at different times of the day. So there's two different kind of ways that I want you to be thinking about it. Is number one, it's a way of life, and number two, it's a spiritual practice, and we'll talk about a couple of very simple practices. Number one, it's a way of life. Anybody heard of Brother Lawrence, Practice the Presence of God? Got a couple of you. It's okay if you don't. It's fine. Brother Lawrence he wrote this tiny book. It's like 42 pages, which are my favorite book lengths. And he's a 7th century Carmelite monk. And he wrote a book that's very, very famous. And in it, he talks about this idea of practicing the presence of God. It's a very simple and straightforward practice. In every activity that you're engaged in, remember that God is present and offer your heart to him in communion with him. Simple, right? Every activity that we do, we offer our heart, we become attentive to God, and we're aware, God, you're here, and I'm aware of this. Yeah, easy, right? I would say it's one of the hardest things to do. So in one way, it's the simplest invitation to a space of presence with God. On the other hand, it's incredibly, incredibly difficult. The Apostle Paul calls this prayer without ceasing, right? I always grew up thinking like the Apostle Paul was talking about praying all the time, like just talking nonstop. And I was like, sounds awful. I don't know how to do that. But the Apostle Paul is actually talking about a way of being with God. That's what he's mentioning when he talks about praying without ceasing. And then number two is going to be a practice, and I'm going to highlight that. Now let's just talk about a couple of the biblical roots and make sure that we're grounding this in the scriptures. The Bible is an Eastern book. Let me say that again. The Bible is actually an Eastern book. And we tend to, as Westerners, read it from a Western lens. Yes? But the truth is, it's actually more oriented towards an Eastern way of thinking and living in the world. So when you think about the world of contemplation or meditation, how many of you are like, oh my gosh, that's for Eastern religion, way over there. I don't want anything to do with that. That's not what we're about. Anybody ever heard that? But the truth of the matter is, the characters in the scripture that we look at over and over and over, Moses, David, Mary, Jesus, they were actually very, very contemplative people. This is the way they lived their lives. Just a couple of examples. We all know the story in the book of Exodus, the character Moses, and he sees what? A burning bush. Now, if we see it through the lens of silence and solitude, it becomes a lot more fascinating because I've been in that kind of region of the world, and like a bush going on fire actually is not that abnormal. It's super dry there during certain seasons, and so at certain seasons, a bush will just go up in flames. What was unique about this, of course, is the bush does not what? It does not burn up. Now, if you think about the process of combustion, how long does it take somebody to stare at a bush long enough to realize this thing is not burning up? It's not one of those things where Moses is just sitting there looking at it. He says, oh my gosh, this is amazing. The process of combustion takes minutes, if not 10, 15 minutes. The idea is, and the rabbis talk about, this is a story of paying attention. It's less of a miracle, and it's more of an invitation to see that God is looking for people to pay attention long enough, and if they do, they get to behold the miracle that's right in front of them. This is a story of attention. He's saying, are you kidding me? Do you not know that my presence is everywhere and there's things happening all around you all the time? I want to teach you and retrain you in the modern world to slow your butts down long enough to be able to notice and pay attention to a God who is here all the time. All the time. And I just miss it. I miss it. I miss it. I swear. want to be so attentive to God. So Moses was very much understood this idea of pace. One writer and author said, we have to slow down to God's pace. Another character, David, remember this guy? This dude's crazy, man. My namesake. He was pretty crazy, but he was absolutely one who understood stillness and silence. And I'm going to actually have us read a psalm at the very end of it. But remember this idea of be still and what? No. Be still and no. Be still. Be still. Be still. I'm going to tell one quick story. And this is where I'm going to connect Pentecostal with silence. I'm going to try to do it. We were hosting this retreat, and we were teaching people kind of the world of connecting charismatic with silence, with God. And one of a person that led a prayer process took us through an exercise that just blew my mind. She had us go into 5 minutes of silence. It was like 20 of us. So we do 5 minutes of silence. And then she says, be still and know that I am God. 5 more minutes of silence. And then she says, be still and know that I am. 5 minutes of silence. And then she says, be still and know. 5 more minutes. Be still. 5 more minutes. Be. And when she gets to be, she starts going, be. 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 She starts shouting, be. She gets up and starts running around the room. Be. Half the room is freaked out. The other half is like, oh, this is amazing. Oh my God. Totally split the room. Runs around shouting at us to be out of the silence. And then all of a sudden she stops. She sits down. And we're all stunned. And she looks at us and she says, that's never happened before. And I had this moment of revelation. The charismatic, expressive side of how God's created us to be, shouting be, and the quiet, still, silent be, connects at be. It's actually the same root. It's all about learning to be with Jesus. This is really about the life of spiritual formation. We say, he is the potter, I am the clay, right? What is that? That's the hand of the Father shaping us. We're not shaping ourselves. It's the Father's hands on us. The kind of intimacy there, that is the invitation and the beautiful part of prayer. And I think that's a powerful invitation for us. Mary treasured things up deep in her heart, and she what? She pondered. Another word translation for that is she contemplated. John the Baptist, that dude's out in the wilderness. We know what he's doing. He's out in the wilderness. And he is absolutely spending time in silence. Jesus often went to a desolate place, a solitary place to pray. Paul, in Hebrews, he says, Jesus makes intercession over us. So sometimes it's good to pray and ask and seek and knock, but oftentimes really the invitation is, if Jesus is already interceding over us, our job is actually to stop and listen to what he's interceding over us. Yeah? That takes a practice for us to enter into that. So Silent prayer is learning to practice, is a practice of focusing our attention upon God through the simplicity of shared presence. Like I mentioned before, we hear a lot of like mindfulness in our culture. And I want to just tell you that's a very different thing. It's not a bad thing, but that's more of like a psychological and health well-being thing. Silence and solitude is connecting to a person, right? Mindfulness is connecting to something else, but solitude and silence is connecting to a person. That person is Jesus. Mother Teresa was once asked by an interviewer, what does God say to her when she prays? She says, I don't talk. I just listen. Thinking the interviewer understood her, says, wonderful, you just listen. What does God say after that? And she says, he doesn't talk. He also listens with me. Isn't that interesting? That'll make you think. So a couple of practices that I just want to mention for you, and we'll finish up here. You're thinking to yourself, all right, I'll try it. I'll give it a shot. How many practice? Let me just like show of hands. How many try to practice silence? Yeah, a few of you. That's okay. Another thing I'll mention, being in solitude is hard in a city, right? Some of you are like, how do I get silence? I have 3 kids. I just want to encourage you. Kate and I were over in Ukraine a week and a half ago. And we were invited to go over there and work with a partner on the ground, and they go to the front lines. And they deliver supplies. They've created like a mobilization unit for churches all over the eastern side where bombs are literally going off. And we got invited to go over there because we heard about a pastor that was in a village that's right next to the front line of the Russians. And he said, I'm not leaving. I'm staying right here. So Kate and I went to the village of Kherson, which is in the news. And right on the other side of the river is the Russians. And every day, 300 rockets are launched into that city. And this pastor said, I'm staying. So we go into the town, and we go meet this pastor. And I mean, if you can imagine, the fear is palpable, right? And we go into the church, and we walk in, and the moment you walk into the church grounds, peace. It's the most bizarre experience to hear rockets going on all around you and for there to be complete peace. So we walk into the church, and the room is full of people. And they're just sitting there silent. I go and sit down, total silence. And there's bombs going off all around us. You want to talk about distraction. That was not silent, but it was. And I tell you, I had goosebumps, the level of the presence of God that was in the room, of God's people coming together and saying, perfect love casts out fear. We're not afraid. Yeah. We're not afraid of this. We're going to take care of each other. It was really beautiful. So I want to invite you to start practicing 5 minutes a day. What would the early morning look like to start 5 minutes a day? What would it look like to start your prayer for a minute of doing silence before you go into prayer? So the invitation is to try to do 5 minutes a day, and that's something that you can grow into. Usually what I do is I end up getting very distracted. That's normal. So I want you to think about distraction not as a liability, but actually a gift. Because I'm telling you, the moment I go into silence, I'm ready to think about the toilet paper that I have not gotten yet. But what I end up doing is the invitation is if you go into a practice of silence, just find a place as quiet as you can. If your kids are screaming next door, that's okay. That's okay. That's your reality. You sit in there and you just open yourself up to God and say, Jesus, I'm here. You're actually interceding over me. And you call me beloved. I'm just going to listen. I'm going to listen with you. And I might not get anything out of this. I just want to be with you. It's really not about getting anything out of it. It's just being, right? If you're a parent, you just love being with your kids most of the time. So enter into a practice, and usually I'll pick a word like peace or Jesus or joy, and I'll use that word. So every time I get distracted and I'm thinking about something else I got to do or the assignment I got to get done, I usually just use that word to kind of draw me back to listen with Jesus. Say, Jesus, you're here. What do you have to say? I'm here to be with you. Sometimes I do this in small groups. So we begin with 5 minutes of silence as a small group. I'm telling you, when you do it in community, test me. Try it maybe in a small group environment. And you can go all sorts of places, but I'm going to keep it very simple in that way. Begin simple. At the very end of an evening, I am very simple. We do what's called examine. It's like a Latin term, sounds really fancy and sophisticated. It's not. It's really just examining your day, and it takes like 2 minutes. But it's really beautiful because you're listening. Examine is listen for the place where God was most alive in you that day. Like where was God most alive in me today? And then where was God least alive? That's it. Just listening. Okay, oh, wow. I was alive having that conversation with that person. And this is what we were talking about. I kind of jot that down. And I'm telling you, over time, you begin to identify the ways in which God tends to move in us uniquely. That's actually really beautiful. That happens by creating space. Let me end with a story, and then we'll just do a reading, and then we're going to have a time of communion together. And just an example of how the power of silence works. Early one morning, my dad was at our house. He's from Chicago. He was in town. And I got up very early. It was like 5 in the morning, and I made like a fire in the fireplace. And again, the sun hasn't come up, and I'm just sitting there enjoying the quiet. And my dad comes down. And he doesn't say a word. He just sits down right behind me. Sits beside me, and we just sit there quietly. And at some point, he lays his hand on my shoulder. Hasn't said a word. And he just sits there, holding hand on my shoulder. And after a few minutes, it just starts like pouring out. This is all I need from my Heavenly Father. I don't even oftentimes need his words. I just need to know that his hand is on my shoulder and he's calling me beloved, and you're good enough, and I love you. That's all he's needing to do. He's got a hand on our shoulder, and that's all he probably wants to do with you oftentimes. You're my son. You're my daughter. I got my hand on you. That's all you need to know. We're going to take a moment, and I'm just going to read a psalm, and you can go ahead if you want to play. You're welcome to. If not, we're just going to listen to a psalm. We're going to practice it just for a minute. You up for that? It's from Psalm 62, and I just want you to just get comfortable, and then we're going to go into worship and go into communion. And I'm just going to read these words over you, and you're just going to let them absorb, get into your spirit, and say, Jesus, I'm here. I'm your son, I'm your daughter. I want to be present with you, and I want to hear your good, true, and beautiful voice over me today. For you alone my soul waits in silence. For my hope is from the beloved. Holding me with strength and steadfast love, my faith shall remain firm. In silence rests my freedom and my guidance. For you are the heart of my heart, my refuge in this silence. Trust in God at all times, O people. Pour out your heart to the beloved. Silence is a refuge for you. So Jesus, we give you thanks for your voice that calls us beloved. We now lift up our voices and we enter into communion as we enter Holy Week, present to you, present to your goodness. In Jesus' name, amen. Would you go ahead and stand with us as we worship together?